Thank you all for coming. I've got to thank Serene Jones, the president of Union. I got an email from her last night saying she couldn't be here because she had to go to Oklahoma because of an illness in the family. But she's been really instrumental in my being here and setting the table for these talks. I met her at a conference a few years ago, and we happened to be taking the same flight back. And on the flight back, I started telling her my story, and I told her, I was raised a Southern Baptist, but had kind of fallen away from that, didn't have any conventional religious affiliation. But I said, I do feel that I have a worldview that qualifies for the term spiritual. I mean, it's consistent with science and everything, but I think it deserves that term, and I've never really put it out as a coherent whole. I've written about bits and pieces of it, and she thought it'd be a good idea for me to try to do this at Union. Put it together, talk about it. That surprised me. It shouldn't have, now that I know more about Union. It's a place where experiment is very welcome. So I've got to thank Serene and all the people at Union who have made me feel welcome. I also have to thank the John Templeton Foundation. It turned out that they were willing to support an endeavor like this in many aspects. There were conversations this fall that some of you were at probably, where there were a series of philosophers and scientists I had conversations with. I especially want to thank Chris Stosky. He's no longer at Templeton, but he's been a great help. He's now finishing his PhD dissertation. And he was especially intrigued by the idea of trying to articulate a spiritual worldview that, doesn't make any claims of special revelation, doesn't appeal to scriptural authority, is not just consistent with science, but informed by science. He liked the idea of a spiritual worldview you could actually argue for, rather than ask people to take your word for it. So he's been great. So I'm going to, over these next 5 lectures, I'm going to present this worldview, not kind of in chapters, not systematically, but chunks of the worldview will show up, and then at the 5th lecture, I will try to do a grand summing up, assuming there's anybody still listening by then. Before you trot out a new term like the new agnosticism, you should Google it to see if it's been used. I did that a couple of weeks ago. Turns out it has. A few people have used the term. There's a piece in Slate about 6 years ago, a piece in the blog Killing the Buddha about 12 years ago that kind of tried to define something they called the new agnosticism. It wasn't exactly what I mean by the term, and I haven't found anybody whose version of it overlaps all that substantially with mine. The piece in Slate by Ron Rosenbaum has some overlap, but the main point is when I talk about the new agnostics, you shouldn't think that I mean that there is some population of people out there calling themselves the new agnostics and I speak for them. So far as I know, there's almost no one calling themselves a new agnostic. There are people I've talked to who I think would qualify for the term as I'm trying to define it, but I don't really speak for anybody but myself. I'm just trying to kind of define some intellectual terrain that I think deserves to be populated. One more clarification about the terminology. I've said I'm going to lay out my spiritual worldview. I've said I'm going to talk about the new agnosticism. I should be clear, those things are not the same, okay? And it's so important to convey this and what the relationship is between them that I've actually brought a diagram. As you can see, in preparing the graphics, I spared no expense. This slide was handcrafted by me. It's artisanal. So this is a space I consider the new agnosticism. You can think of it as an intellectual space. MSWV stands for My Spiritual Worldview. That's in there somewhere. It is consistent with the new agnosticism, but you can imagine other spiritual worldviews. Some might overlap with mine, some might not. And by the way, my worldview does not have a name. So if anybody here comes up with one, if anybody exhibits the stamina to actually sit through all 5 lectures and you have an idea, let me know. I don't think MSWV is gonna catch on probably. But anyway, that's my spiritual worldview. Okay, so what do I mean by the new agnosticism? Well, I would define it via 2 contrasts. One is obviously with the old agnosticism. I need to distinguish it from that. And the other is from the new atheism. I think there are contrasts in both cases that are illuminating. I'm going to start with the old agnosticism, talking about that. And if you're wondering what the old agnosticism was, well, the term was coined by Thomas Huxley, a friend and supporter of Darwin's, about 150 years ago. And here's what he had to say about it. Whoops, that's going backwards. It is wrong for a man to say he is certain of the objective truth of any proposition unless he can produce evidence which logically justifies that certainty. So, in other words, if you're not sure there is a God, or you're not sure there isn't a God, you shouldn't claim either. If you're not sure there isn't a God, you shouldn't call yourself an atheist. Now, he saw this agnosticism, which just means without knowing, not knowing, as very much in the spirit of science. He wrote, agnosticism is the essence of science, whether ancient or modern. It simply means that a man shall not say he knows or believes that which he has no scientific grounds for professing to know or believe. So in other words, be aware of what you know, be aware of what you don't know, and be aware of what possibilities are left open by what you don't know, and adopt a stance of appropriate intellectual humility in light of what you don't know. Now, my contention is that one thing science has done since Huxley lived and wrote is actually increase the amount of intellectual humility that is appropriate. Okay, that may sound counterintuitive because, after all, science has tremendously increased our stockpile of knowledge. We've figured all kinds of things out. But oddly, science has, while adding to the number of things we know, has also highlighted a number of things that we can't fathom, things that we don't know, and has suggested that we may never completely understand these things. It has shown the world to be, weirder and more baffling than I think Huxley might have imagined. I'm sure you know part of the story. Albert Einstein, theory of relativity, pretty strange implications. Time travel, for example. You've probably seen the movies, Planet of the Apes, Interstellar. Person fired off into space, they go at a very high speed, so their aging slows down. They come back to planet Earth. A lot of time has passed. The apocalypse either has ensued or not ensued, depending on the movie. But either way, physicists tell us this can actually happen. Now, then came quantum physics, which is so weird that Einstein himself could not accept it. Okay, there were a couple of weird things about quantum physics that he just couldn't buy, a number of them actually. Here's just a couple quickly. There's the phenomenon of entanglement, where you have two particles that have a certain kind of relationship, and they are fired off in opposite directions, and by measuring one of them, you force it into a state that then determines the state of the other particle instantaneously, with no time passing, even if the other particle is 10,000 miles away. They've actually done the experiments. It happens. It's sometimes said that the particles are communicating with each other instantaneously. That's a little too spooky for my taste. I think that's best seen as a metaphor, but it is fair to say that influence spreads in some sense instantaneously. Einstein couldn't buy that. He thought the speed of light should be like a speed limit. Nothing should go faster than that. But they've done the experiments, as I said. Another thing Einstein couldn't accept is that things happen in the physical universe for which there is no cause in the physical universe. Okay? You measure a particle, it either comes up heads or tails, so to speak, but which state it occupies is not caused by anything in the physical universe. According to quantum physics, Einstein couldn't buy that either, but physicists insist that he was wrong, and they're right. Now, I'm not, suggesting that, if things happen without a physical cause, maybe there's a God up there using these loopholes in the causal closure of the universe to manipulate things. I don't really do a lot with the physics stuff for purposes of my own worldview in a specific way. I'm mainly just saying that the universe is a really weird place. I'm also saying, in Huxley's day, if you had said there are things that happen in the physical world that have no cause in the physical world, he would have said, well, that's supernatural. You're claiming supernatural things happen. Well, physicists are telling us that happens, and that's pretty weird. Okay, so since Huxley's time, I think as we have understood more and more, the amount of kind of profound mystery has grown. And I would contrast the word mystery with the word wonder. You often hear people, especially kind of atheists and agnostics, when asked, where does the spiritual part of their life come from? They may say, well, I feel a sense of wonder when I contemplate nature. You look out at the Milky Way, you realize the number of solar systems that represents, not to mention the number of galaxies like the Milky Way there are in the universe, and you're filled with a sense of wonder. Okay, but that's wonder about something that we know to be the case and that we understand. It's kind of clear. It's amazing, but it's clear. It's awe. I feel it. It's great. But with quantum physics, you get this sense of mystery that just feels a little different, a little more Twilight Zone-y or something, maybe a little more profound, but certainly different. And I think since Huxley's time, the occasion for that kind of awe has grown by virtue of science. Okay, now I said that this physics stuff I don't make a big deal of for purposes of my own spiritual worldview. One thing I do emphasize in my own worldview is the mystery of consciousness, the mind-body problem, the question of like subjective experience, sentience, and what its relationship to the body is. And I think, the question's been around a long time, the question of the mind-body problem, but I actually think that oddly, science has highlighted, as science has explained more and more things relevant to the question, has actually highlighted how kind of baffling the question is. And here's what I mean by that. So, 150, 200 years ago, among the schools of thought on the consciousness question were these two, okay? First, there were people who said, well, consciousness, kind of sentience, is the subjective experience. It's this kind of metaphysical stuff that animates the body. It's kind of like a soul, okay? And without it, the body can't run. An opposite, more or less, view would have been, well, actually, the body can run itself. It's just a machine. And consciousness, awareness, subjective experience is, if anything, just a product of the machinery running, okay? That's two very different worldviews, two very different views of the mind-body problem. Now, I would say on balance, science has tended to favor the second view, that consciousness is kind of generated by the body, but doesn't in turn influence the body. If there's one view that has been favored by science on balance, I'd say it's that one. And the reason is, first of all, as we have delved more and more deeply into the way the body works and the way the mind works, it just seems to be a machine. We keep understanding it. Cellular level, subcellular level, it all makes sense. It's working like a machine. We don't need to invoke any spooky forces. The other thing is that, with brain imaging and neuroscience, we see closer and closer correlations between the state of the brain and the state of consciousness. And if you manipulate the brain, probe the brain, that creates certain states of consciousness. So all of this makes it perfectly plausible that consciousness is a product of the body and the brain, but doesn't influence them. But here's the question that philosophers have really only fairly recently come to appreciate is, well, if that's the case, if consciousness doesn't do anything, then what is it for? Okay, why? It's kind of mysterious. You've got this stuff that doesn't do anything. Why would that be part of nature? So, for example, just to kind of try to put a finer point on it, the idea from modern science basically is that if you put your hand too close to a flame and you feel the heat and you withdraw it, that it isn't the feeling of heat that's really doing the work. Scientists would say, no, we understand the whole thing. It's nerve cells, muscles, and so on. It's just a machine doing the reflex. Well, then what is the feeling of heat for? What is it functionally for? I think I better click this because I just realized on this computer we have not set the power settings for it not to sleep. And it's possible that a tech mishap could afflict us tonight. It's imaginable. So this is, and if you imagine natural selection working itself, along, you start with cells and so on, They're just, according to the theory of natural selection, they're just machines. There's no reason to think that consciousness is really needed at any point, according to the kind of the standard scientific worldview. I wrote a book in 1988 called Three Scientists and Their Gods, and I called consciousness evolutionarily superfluous. And as I said, I think there's more and more. It isn't just me talking. More and more, we had a great conversation here with David Chalmers and Rebecca Neuberger-Goldstein last fall, two philosophers who are really ahead of the curve on this. And we all kind of agreed that consciousness is pretty mysterious. Now, why do I pay so much attention to consciousness? Well, because it's the source of life's meaning, right? I mean, if there were no subjective experience, if there were no pain, no feelings of love, no pleasure, well then, what would be the point? I mean, if you heard about a planet of kind of robots, they looked like us, but there was no interior life, then you heard that the planet blew up, you probably wouldn't spend a lot of time lamenting it, right? I mean, what had been lost if there was if there were no feelings on that planet? Then life just would not have meaning the way life has meaning for us. So, it's just kind of interesting that the thing that gives life meaning, in my view, is a thing that it looks like science cannot explain. And moreover, the way you reach this conclusion, at least for now it can't explain it. There's good reason to think it may never, but in any event, it's baffling now. And interestingly, you reach this conclusion by thinking like a scientific materialist, okay? By conceding, okay, the body's a machine. Thinking like a hardcore scientist is what highlights this mystery. Science also tells us something interesting about consciousness, which is that since presumably sentience, consciousness, grows in accordance with kind of a biological complexity, specifically neural complexity, well, if you grant that, seems to be the case, then evolution has tended to increase consciousness because natural selection has built more and more complicated organisms over time. And in that sense, evolution has increased meaning over time. I mean, you could view natural selection in this sense as a machine for generating more and more meaning, and I don't think that's a crazy way to look at it. And when I think about that, I guess I have a combination of kind of wonder and mystery, I feel. I understand how natural selection works and why it increases the biological complexity, and that's wondrous enough, but it's kind of mysterious that there's this consciousness thing added in that gives life meaning and more meaning as time goes on. Okay, so that's my contrast with the old agnosticism. Before moving on to the new atheists, I just want to summarize that I think there are now more grounds for intellectual humility than in Huxley's day when the term agnosticism was coined. We're more and more aware of what we don't know and may never know. And it isn't just that science has kind of failed to provide enough answers, it has actually highlighted the mysteries. And some of these mysteries are pretty fundamental. As I said, consciousness is about the meaning of life. Some questions in quantum physics, wave-particle duality and so on, are about kind of determinism. And the alternative to determinism famously is free will. So these are fundamental things that we just may never understand. Okay, so for my money, I guess I would say the argument for agnosticism relative to atheism has gotten at least a little stronger since Huxley wrote. I think of the new agnosticism as kind of a more inviting space in a certain sense than the old agnosticism, at least a little, and also perhaps a little more suggestive of spiritual possibility. Now on to the new atheists. Okay, so who are the new atheists? There are the original four new atheists. Sam Harris, Richard Dawkins, Daniel Dennett, Christopher Hitchens. They were dubbed the new atheists. They all wrote kind of atheist manifestos. Sam Harris's famous book, The End of Faith, and so on. Christopher Hitchens' book, God is Not Great. Christopher passed away a few years ago. Since then, some more people have been added to the roster, I think. Here's a couple people. Lawrence Krauss, whom we had here at Union this fall, and Jerry Coyne, the paleontologist. Lawrence is a physicist. I'm not sure that all these people would call themselves new atheists, but as a sociological matter, they're often lumped in with the new atheists and are said to evince some of the characteristics of new atheists, which leads to the question, what are the characteristics of the new atheists? What's distinctive about them? Well, I would say one thing, kind of famously, is a lack of what I've been emphasizing, intellectual humility, a lack of intellectual humility. By that, I don't just mean that they're sure God doesn't exist. That's always been what atheism was. That's the old atheism as well, the certainty that God doesn't exist. And I'm not just talking about a tendency to ridicule religious belief or religious believers, although they do some of that as well, some of them. And I should emphasize that, there are very few things that all the new atheists do. I'll try to appropriately qualify things and not refer to. You shouldn't assume that anything I attribute to any one new atheist applies to all of them. But it isn't just religious people whose they evince disdain for. Here's a tweet from Richard Dawkins. Spent the evening with 4 philosophers trying to convince myself we need them. Surely we can all think clearly anyway? Then I remembered Twitter. So apparently the idea is he doesn't need philosophers. These scientists who think clearly don't need philosophers, but the stupid people on Twitter who criticize him and his fellow new atheists do need philosophers. Okay, so this is sometimes said to be a sign of scientism. The term scientism means an overly broad conception of science's domain of authority. So, for example, when you start encroaching on the turf of philosophers illegitimately, that would be an example of scientism. A number of the new atheists have written books that have been accused of scientism, and I just want to quickly down a few and give you my thumbnail take on them because some of them are relevant to my own worldview. Okay, so this is Sam Harris's book, The Moral Landscape. Subtitle is How Science Can Determine Human Values. Well, all I'd say about that is I would join the many philosophers who say if he means by that like bedrock values, that's just wrong. So, in other words, if you're like deciding whether to be a utilitarian, and consider the greatest good to be whatever brings the greatest happiness to the most people, or in contrast to be, say, a virtue ethicist and believe that no, an ethical system shouldn't be devoted to maximizing overall well-being, it should be devoted to nourishing specific virtues like courage or honesty or whatever. If you're trying to make that decision, what are my bedrock values going to be? I don't think there's any way you can make the case that science determines those values. There's a much less significant sense in which science can inform values, and we don't have time to get into this, but it's that less significant sense that Sam spends most of his time on in the book. And sometimes, to be honest, it's unclear to me whether he's trying to make the stronger argument. But I would certainly agree with the many people who said the stronger version of the argument doesn't work. Okay, Universe from Nothing by Lawrence Krauss. Note the subtitle, Why There Is Something Rather Than Nothing. You may have heard of this famous philosophical and even theological conundrum, although the theologists think they have an answer, of course, but they start with the question, why is there something rather than nothing? Lawrence purports to answer it. If any of you were present for the conversation I had with Lawrence right here in the fall, you know that I am not persuaded, and I think it's fair to say this is kind of a consensus among philosophers, to not be persuaded, and the reason is pretty simple to spell out, and it's just basically that when philosophers say, why is there something rather than nothing, they mean nothing, okay? They mean no physical states, no physical laws, no space-time continuum. And it's just kind of in principle impossible to use scientific laws to explain how you got to a place that didn't have scientific laws to a place that you did. So Lawrence can show you that, particles seem to emerge from vacuum states, which I'll take his word on, but of course a vacuum state is a physical state existing in a space-time continuum, so we're not really starting out with nothing. There's a book, I want to spend a little more time on Richard Dawkins' book, which actually gets accused of scientism much less often than the other two, and I think is harder to criticize. But there's something I do, again, this is yet another fairly audacious subtitle, Why the Evidence of Evolution Reveals a Universe Without Design. Well, if you take that to mean that he's showing us that the universe couldn't be the product of design, I don't think he really shows that. What he does show is that animals and plants on this planet were created by natural selection. Okay, so they weren't created by some hands-on creator God. That much is clear. But as for whether the universe is a product of design, who knows? I mean, you could view the Big Bang as a kind of algorithm in which laws were unleashed that led to the current universe. And it's not impossible that the algorithm itself was a product of design. We just have no way of knowing. And if in that algorithm was the likelihood of natural selection happening on various planets, then in that sense, if the algorithm was designed, and we don't know, then in that sense you could say that actually even life is ultimately a manifestation of design in some very indirect sense. The physicist Lee Smolin has a really interesting, highly conjectural hypothesis called cosmological natural selection. And in this scenario, universes actually replicate themselves, perhaps through black holes. And if that's true, he's pointed out, then it would work like natural selection, that over time you'd get more and more universes with properties conducive to replication. And so maybe that's why there's so many black holes. Those are the portals of reproduction, and you get universes with more and more of those. And there is a variant of cosmological natural selection that suggests that, well, maybe the way universes can get replicated is eventually life evolves to this level of superintelligence, way smarter than us, and it figures out how to engineer the replication of a universe, and it builds into the algorithm the likelihood that more life will get created, and then that life will get smart and create more universes. So that's one variant of the theory of cosmological natural selection. The point is just that this is a serious scientist in a conjectural mode, but serious scientist, serious hypothesis, and in that scenario, life would be, in a sense, a product of design, even though, of course, natural selection is true, in my view. So when Dawkins writes in the preface of his book, our own existence is a mystery no longer, it is solved, I kind of take issue with that. I mean, it's partly solved. We know where animals came from. They came from natural selection. We don't know where natural selection came from. It's an interesting question. There's a number of, I'd like to know, how likely is natural selection to take root on a planet? Why did it do it here? There's a lot of questions. I wouldn't say the mystery is totally solved. So a lot of audacious subtitles. One New Atheist doesn't even wait for the subtitle. Dan Dennett just puts it in the title, Consciousness Explained. Given what I've already said about consciousness, you might imagine that I'm skeptical that he succeeds, but in any event, it's worth reading. All these books are worth reading. And I want to emphasize that kind of oddly, I have in the past kind of been on their team. I am a Darwinian. Particularly Dennett and Dawkins, I'm a champion of evolutionary psychology. In 1994, I wrote a book called The Moral Animal. That was a manifesto for evolutionary psychology from within a framework of scientific materialism. I haven't changed my mind about any of that. So I buy into much of the worldview, but I do think there is, in a sense, some overreaching going on in some of these books. The amount varies from book to book. I'd say very little, actually, in Dawkins' book. It's a solid book. If you fiddle with one phrase and change the subtitle, I'd be fine with it. More in other books, more overreaching in other books. As for whether they actually commit the crime of scientism, that determination is above my pay grade. I would say, at a minimum, that at a time when intellectual humility seems more warranted than ever, at least to me, many of the new atheists do not exude intellectual humility. Okay, but there's another sense in which some of them lack intellectual humility, and in my view, this is much more consequential. Okay, and this gets at another meaning of the term new in new atheists. What else is new about the new atheists compared to the old atheists? Well, they actually proselytize. They actually try to convert people to atheism. That traditionally hasn't been part of the definition of atheism. Some atheists might have done it, but there were atheists who kind of, said, well, I wish I could believe in God. The people who believe in God seem happy, seem like nice people. I'm not going to try to disabuse them of the notion that God exists. But these atheists insist on conversion. And the reason is because they think religion is a really bad thing. How bad? Well, again, a subtitle pretty much says it. How religion poisons everything. Is that bad enough for you? Everything. It's Chris Hitchens. Even if you grant that the subtitle is intentionally hyperbolic, he is still, at a minimum, claiming that religion is overwhelmingly bad. And if you're going to make that case, you run into certain problems. Like, for example, a lot of good things have been done in the name of religion. Martin Luther King famously fought for justice, heroically resisted the temptation to resort to violence, and so on. So how does Chris Hitchens, how did he handle the case of Martin Luther King? Well, here's what he did. He said, well, it's an important part of Christian doctrine that people who do bad things go to hell. Actually, the doctrine's a little more complicated than that, but for his purposes, I think that's the way he was thinking. And he notes that Martin Luther King never threatened his many tormentors with eternal condemnation. Even though he was actually stabbed in the chest, but he never said, you're going to hell, Chris Hitchens points out. And then he says this, at no point did Dr. King even hint that those who injured and reviled him were to be threatened with any revenge or punishment in this world or the next, save the consequences of their own brute selfishness and stupidity, and he even phrased that appeal more courteously than, in my humble opinion, its targets deserved. Then the key sentence, in no real as opposed to nominal sense, then, was he a Christian? Problem solved. He wasn't religious. Naturally, he did good things. He wasn't really religious. Now, it's kind of ironic because what he's saying Dr. King did was turn the other cheek. You may have heard that phrase, kind of famously associated with the New Testament, as is the phrase, love your enemy, emphasis on forgiveness, and so on. There's a problem here, I feel kind of bad because Chris is no longer alive. I debated him on Blogging Heads TV. You can Google it if you want to give him his say, because I confronted him with this and other things, and he did very well. He was a great debater. I'm not saying I won the debate. I'm just saying, if you want his side of the story, it's online. We're seeing a kind of a lack of intellectual humility, a bold, sweeping assertion that I think is not backed up. But this does not qualify as scientism. This is not exaggerating the domain of science. This is just a failure to do science properly, okay? Because science consists of, carefully using evidence to investigate a question with due respect for the complexity of the question. And if you ask social scientists, well, how should we tackle this question of whether religion does more harm than good, they say, well, that's kind of a messy one, but for starters, you might try to do some kind of honest accounting of whether, the relative number of good things done in the name of religion to bad things. You could try that, but you would still face a more stubborn problem, which is determining whether the things done in the name of religion are actually done because of religion, okay? So is it the case that whenever there is conflict in which religious people cite a religious doctrine or their religious identity, that the religion per se is really the motivating factor, as opposed to some material circumstances that might have incited even non-religious people to violence? Well, one person who seems to think that the answer to that question is yes, it's the religion in any religious conflict, at least judging by his book, God Delusion, is Richard Dawkins. In that book, he said, if it were not for religion, there would be no Israel-Palestine conflict. Now, people who know the history of the Middle East, I think, would be rightly skeptical. Zionism itself was a fundamentally secular thing. It wasn't a very religious movement. The initial Palestinian reaction against it was not particularly religious. What may may have been, I guess you could call the first act of Palestinian terrorism on American soil, and one of the very few, so far as I know, was in the 1960s when Sirhan assassinated Robert Kennedy. He explicitly said it was because of Kennedy's support for Israel, I think involving arms transfers. But in any event, he said, I did it for my nation. He didn't mention religion. I did it for my nation, meaning at that point Jordan, which had possession of the West Bank. And in any event, by the way, Sirhan was actually a Christian, if you're keeping score. So I think that's kind of I think Dawkins is wrong about that. But he is joined in this view that religion is the problem by Sam Harris, who does a very takes a systematic look at it in his book The End of Faith. He actually considers several material circumstances. This is a quote from his book that could, in theory, contribute to terrorism. The Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, the collusion of Western powers with corrupt dictatorships, the endemic poverty and lack of economic opportunity that now plague the Arab world. Then he writes, but I will argue that we can ignore all of these things or treat them only to place them safely on the shelf because the world is filled with poor, uneducated, and exploited peoples who do not commit acts of terrorism, indeed who would never commit terrorism of the sort that has become so commonplace among Muslims. Now, I'd encourage you to reflect on that logic for a second. Because that is exactly like saying, we know that smoking does not cause lung cancer because the world is full of people who smoke and don't get lung cancer. Exact same structure of the argument. And of course, that doesn't make sense. In the real world, causality is a complicated thing. There's such a thing as a contributing factor that is only decisive in the presence of other contributing factors. In cancer, it might be a genetic predisposition. With terrorism, it's a lot more complicated than that. But the point is, the logic just doesn't make sense. In fact, you could turn it around on Sam and say, well, we know that religion, and even Islam specifically, don't cause terrorism because the world is full of religious people and Muslims who don't commit terrorism. That would be exactly analogous to this argument. Now, you might ask, how could he commit, just an out-and-out logical fallacy like that? And I would say, because he's human, we all do this. We get attached to arguments, and we like to believe that we're right. There are now famously a lot of so-called cognitive biases, such as confirmation bias, that steer us in this direction. And in fact, I would say evolutionary psychology has shown, or at least suggests, that these biases were kind of engineered into the human mind by natural selection because they helped get genes into the next generation. But in any event, we're all susceptible to them. Some of the new atheists sometimes act as if they speak as if, they and their fellow scientific rationalists are not really susceptible. So Lawrence Krauss has said, scientists love to be proven wrong. If you know any scientists, that's actually not true. They would rather be right. They may graciously concede evidence that contradicts their theory, but not always. The philosopher of science Thomas Kuhn said that when a new paradigm comes into science, it isn't that the adherents of the old paradigm look at the evidence and embrace it. No, to get the new paradigm totally instantiated securely, you just have to wait for the old scientist to die or retire. That often that's really the way it works. I mean, Einstein didn't buy quantum physics. So anyway, if you are inclined to dismiss the significance of material circumstances, then you're naturally going to blame religion, and you're going to say things like this: it is time we admitted that we are not at war with terrorism, as Sam Harris has said. We are at war with Islam. This is not to say that we are at war with all Muslims, but we are absolutely at war with the vision of life that is prescribed to all Muslims in the Quran. I guess it's good that he added the second part, kind of, and said, I'm not talking about all Muslims. On the other hand, that just introduces what I think is kind of a confusion here. I think any scholar of religion pretty much would say that it doesn't make sense to equate Islam with the vision of life that is prescribed to all Muslims in the Quran. I mean, all religions, over time and across space, manifest themselves in all kinds of different ways. and interpret their texts in all kinds of different ways. So just that equation, to act as if there is some essence of Islam that you can infer from just reading the text is, I think, kind of naive. In any event, Sam, given his view of the role of religion in all this, says we should profile, this is about airport screening, we should profile Muslims or anyone who looks like he or she could conceivably be a Muslim, and we should be honest about it. Richard Dawkins, who also tends to, I would say, give insufficient emphasis to the role of material circumstances in fomenting terrorism, also has a dim view of Islam. His tweet, haven't read the Quran, so couldn't quote chapter and verse. But often I say Islam is the greatest force for evil today, and he also sometimes just seems to kind of just enjoy kind of antagonizing Muslims. Here's one. All the world's Muslims have fewer Nobel Prizes than Trinity College, Cambridge. They did great things in the Middle Ages, though. Very nice of him to throw in that last thing about the Middle Ages. I'm sure that Muslims are deeply appreciative of that comment. Okay, so I know this sounds like a tangent. I started out talking about my spiritual worldview, cosmic science, and so on. Suddenly I'm just listing kind of offensive things that new atheists have said about Muslims. It's not as much of a tangent as it sounds like, because my spiritual worldview actually has an historical dimension. It's my view that repeatedly in human history there have been times when humanity approached an important threshold, and that we are at one now, and that either we move toward a cohesive global community or things could get very, very bad. And I think, avoiding a kind of downward spiral is a big moral and spiritual challenge facing all of humanity. And I worry that not thinking wisely and clearly about terrorism could contribute to a kind of a catastrophic outcome. Now, this apocalyptic thinking is actually something I have in common with Sam Harris. This is one thing we share. Here's something he wrote in The End of Faith. We must find our way to a time when faith, without evidence, disgraces anyone who would claim it. Given the present state of our world, there appears to be no other future worth wanting. It is imperative that we begin speaking plainly about the absurdity of most of our religious beliefs. I fear, however, that the time has not yet arrived. In this sense, what follows is written very much in the spirit of a prayer. I pray that we may one day think clearly enough about these matters to render our children incapable of killing themselves over books. So, again, I share the overall apocalyptic sensibility, and I agree that a failure to think clearly enough, as he puts it, could contribute to the apocalypse. I don't agree with him that this problem of unclear thinking is confined largely to religious people, for reasons that may be evident by now. I don't think, therefore, that religious belief needs to be expunged from the planet. In fact, I think all religions have shown that they can evince a horrible, belligerent side, an intolerant side, or a tolerant, beneficent side, and that much of it depends on the circumstances, including the kinds of circumstances that Sam kind of illogically dismissed earlier. And there are some other things that I think can bring out the worst in religion, such as saying you are at war with the religion, or calling the religion evil, or saying that the official criterion for profiling people at airports should be whether they look like Muslims. I think those kinds of things do bring out the worst in religion, and I think doing them can actually be a result of unclear thinking, even unclear thinking by non-religious people. Okay, so when I debated Sam Harris in Los Angeles a few years ago, and Richard Dawkins was in the audience, and during the question and answer session, he asked me a kind of challenging question. He said, because I'd already criticized his views on Israel-Palestine, and he said, well, isn't it the case that when two religious groups are fighting with each other, if they didn't consider themselves members of the religious group, they wouldn't be fighting? That's certainly true. That's certainly true. I mean, the Catholics and the Protestants in Northern Ireland, if they didn't think of themselves as members of those groups, there wouldn't be that group conflict. On the other hand, that's not driven by religious ideology, that particular thing. That wasn't about religious doctrine. It was really about the two groups' place in the kind of socioeconomic scheme and the history of that and their relative access to power and so on. And that's also true. Even things like Sunni Shia sectarianism, even if people are invoking religious doctrines to justify it, if you look at how these things actually start, it's often an analogous situation in Lebanon and Iraq or whatever, where the two ethnic groups had very different relationships to power. So sociologists call this an ethnic marker, when religion serves as just a source of your group identity. It's not the only kind of ethnic marker. Race can be an ethnic marker. Nationalism. So when the Serbs in the 90s rounded up 10,000 Muslim men and executed them, that was more of a nationalistic kind of thing, and nationality was serving as the ethnic marker. Even ideology can... wait, no, I don't want to say that yet. What I want to say is that all of these problems, regardless of the nature of the ethnic marker, nationalism, race, religion, I think the real problem here is what you could call the problem of tribal psychology. Again, another product of natural selection. And the term tribal psychology is in a way misleading because, you think tribes rampaging, you think I'm just talking about aggression. But more and more from the science of psychology, it's clear that actually, no, a lot of the important tribal psychology happens earlier when the groups are convincing themselves that they're in the right, that their grievances are just, that the other group isn't in the right. And this can involve the kind of subtle coloring of all kinds of perceptions. And so I would submit that when the new atheists say that religion is the problem, it's actually a subset of the problem. Broadly speaking, the psychology of tribalism is the problem. And when I said that I think humankind is on kind of a threshold, and needs to get its act together, I largely meant overcoming the psychology of tribalism. Here is where I was going to mention ideology, because I think even the ideological conflict that's threatening to kind of tear America apart right now, I would say it's getting so bitter. It's the same psychology at work. It's the psychology of tribalism. I would say that tribal psychology even afflicts the new atheists. It's common to say that the new atheists act like a religion. Well, I don't know about that, but yeah, I think like so many groups, they do sometimes evince a tribal psychology. And in fact, I think, I'll talk about this in the next lecture on Tuesday, but I think the specific fallacy that Sam Harris committed that I discussed was actually plausibly driven by a specific cognitive bias that's part of the psychology of tribalism that we've only come to understand clearly within the last 30 years ago. It's not confirmation bias, it's subtler than that, and it's very interesting. And I have the same problem. I also suffer from the psychology of tribalism. I think of myself as in opposition to the new atheists in some sense. When I read their stuff, I'm feeling extra critical, looking for those flaws. If I read some diatribe against them, my critical faculties can desert me because I'm eager to believe it. That's the way it is. It's a problem that afflicts us all. So when I say that transcending tribal psychology is a great spiritual challenge, I mean it's one for all of us. And I use the word spiritual challenge advisedly because I think it is so subtle and stubborn, getting over these various cognitive biases, that sometimes nothing less than a spiritual discipline, like meditation or whatever, will make much progress. Okay, so I just want to quickly, the end is near, believe me. I want to quickly return to this map. You laugh. I worked hard on that. Just to be clear where a couple of things are situated here, like this whole apocalyptic thing, this whole belief of mine that catastrophe will ensue unless we all, humankind collectively gets much better at seeing its own cognitive biases. I wouldn't call that part of the new agnosticism. That's my own little hobby horse in my own little spiritual worldview there. At the same time, I would say that, science is showing us that there are all these cognitive biases. There's been a lot of progress on this front. And so it's in the spirit of the new agnosticism broadly, which is very respectful of science, to be mindful of cognitive biases. I'd also say that, learning about all these cognitive biases is really another thing about science since Huxley's day that should give us more intellectual humility, just appreciating what an imperfect instrument the human mind is. So on those grounds as well, careful attention to cognitive biases is naturally part of the new atheism. I'd say much the same about not ridiculing people for their beliefs, for their religious beliefs. I mean, that's certainly part of my worldview. But I think it's kind of logically. I'm giving a union lecture today, apparently. So if any of you. It is in the. I actually think we're done here. So. But that won't help. Okay, but we are done. We're not quite done. Don't get excited. We're very, very close to done. So anyway, it is in the spirit of the new agnosticism, being as it is committed to intellectual humility, to not make fun of people for their religious beliefs. There's the additional fact that there's more and more evidence that often has the opposite of the intended effect. It makes fundamentalists more fundamentalist. So I do consider that an important thing. I said at the outset that I sometimes see people who I think qualify as new agnostics, even if they're not calling themselves that. And one thing these people do is they tend to judge people by their behavior, not their beliefs. Okay? They're like, whatever, if you believe in God and that belief makes you a good person, fine, God bless you, whatever. If you treat other people decently, that's all we ask for. And I'm in favor of that attitude. Okay, so we're about to go to question and answer. You'll be happy to hear. I want to say a couple things. First of all, I promise the next lectures will be shorter, appreciably shorter. One reason is the next couple of lectures are actually going to have a guest that's going to interrogate me after the lecture. On Tuesday, it will be Paul Bloom, psychologist from Yale. We're going to talk about evil, moral imagination, empathy. We disagree on some of these things, so that should be lively. I will again use some of the new atheists as foils, which is one of my favorite things to do with him. Then a week from Tuesday, the famously contentious science writer John Horgan will be here. We'll be arguing about history, moral progress, can we stop war, things like that. One last point before Q&A. I think I owe it to you to tell you why I consider my worldview spiritual, or what I mean by spiritual. How is it that a wholly scientific worldview can qualify for that term? Well, one thing I think you see in many spiritual worldviews, traditional spiritual worldviews, is the idea that in our kind of ordinary way of looking at the world, our ordinary everyday consciousness, there's some fundamental truth we don't naturally see, okay? So in some religious traditions, this might be God, or more abstractly, divinity. In other traditions, like in Buddhism, it might be more a metaphysical truth, like the not-self concept, or what's called emptiness. But in all of these cases, the idea is that if we saw something fundamental more clearly, that would bring our behavior into closer alignment with moral truth, and we would be better people. Well, at a certain level of abstraction, I believe that. I mean, as you know, I think that there are all these cognitive biases built into us by natural selection, and collectively, at times, they can amount to a real delusion, and they can make us do very, very bad things. I do think that often, just ordinary consciousness, when we're looking at ourselves and other people and our relation to them in ways that our brain actually was engineered to look at them by natural selection, when we're looking at things that way, often we are really a long, long way from the truth. We're a long, long way from the objective truth, to say nothing of the moral truth. and that really seeing the truth calls for digging a lot deeper. So thank you. Now we can do question and answer. And it's been a while. So we'll do this for a little while, and then I'll give people a chance to leave who might want to. But I'll stick around as long as people want to talk. As long as let me ask first: is there anybody who wants to speak for the new atheists here? Because they weren't here to defend themselves. Okay, we have a new atheist surrogate here. Okay, there's a microphone coming to you.
I think one of the ideas that Sam Harris and I think Bill Maher is pretty crazy about is the idea that some of the illiberal ideas in the world, for instance, like treatment of women like as second-class citizens, treatment of homosexuals, separation of church and state, are more prevalent in the Muslim world than in any other religious culture. I mean, the new atheists, their proposal is to blame it on Islam as a whole. So I guess my question is, what do you think about that? Yeah.
Well, I mean, first of all, there are things that are correlated with all kinds of religions that I'm not enthusiastic about. And as a practical matter, the question is, if you would like to change them, what's the most productive thing to do? And I don't think, kind of grabbing people by the shoulders and saying, your God doesn't exist, don't you understand, is the best approach. It tends to have, again, the opposite effect of fomenting fundamentalism. I mean, that said, there's certainly a correlation there. On the one hand, you could trace it to Quranic text, Islamic law, plausibly. On the other hand, there's a lot of stuff in the Bible that, if straightforwardly manifested, would lead to conditions for women that are worse than they are in this country. And I think the question I would just raise, I mean, I don't deny such correlations or that they are sometimes connected to text. I would emphasize two things. The correlation is not determinative. There's a huge variation in Muslim societies, not to mention the way Muslims in America live, a lot of whom you're not even aware are Muslims. They behave so much like other people in America in terms of their treatment of women. The other thing I'd say is, if you, sometimes in sociology, when there's something correlated with race, you correct for income and you find that the correlation disappears. Okay, it's really just something poor people are doing, not black people in particular. It's just that they're disproportionately poor. There's an interesting kind of related question about religion, which is, if you correct for kind of level of economic development, and technological situation and so on, do some of these things disappear, or at least are some of the correlations weakened? And I suspect that they are. Now, some people, like maybe some of the new atheists would say, well, the reason that on average there are more Muslim countries that are at a lower level of technological and economic development than the United States is the religion has held them back. I actually have an alternative explanation of my own pet theory, so I don't buy that. But in any event, I personally think a more important variable than religious text is like, where is the society in its development? Is it closely integrated with other countries in a fine-grained way, kind of economically and culturally? Because remember, all of the societies in the world once had values that just seem incredibly primitive by modern standards, including America's own treatment of women, 80 years ago. You also want to speak for the new atheists? Okay. Okay, can you wait for the microphone here?
Yeah, just introduce some interesting facts. I have heard that there are slightly more Hindu women killed in honor killings every year than Muslim women, which suggests that it's not, Muslims are the worst or whatever. And actually they have, some men who have committed honor killings in Pakistan were interviewed, and the interviewer said, they said, do you think that the religion of Islam permits honor killings? And the men kind of blushed and said, well, no, actually the Quran says you're not supposed to do that, but it doesn't matter. You have to set an example sometimes, which suggests that it comes more from a local culture of, family structures and stuff, and that actually people set aside their religion in order to do those kind of barbaric things. Just to introduce some facts into it.
And I would just say that that's the other variable you need to correct for is culture separate from religion. So, for example, many Muslim countries are Arab countries, but there are things about Arab culture that are technically separate from Islam, but may manifest themselves in the way some Muslim Arabs behave. Okay.
And to speak on behalf of the New Atheists, I would say that in your debate with Sam Harris, you said religion may be wrong, but doesn't necessarily mean that it's bad. Whereas he said, I think wrong is bad in the long term. I think if you believe something with no reason behind it, it can trip people up in the long run. And an example I would use is like with segregation, there were religious arguments for it and religious arguments against it, because you can interpret Christianity in whatever way you want to, but there's no real scientific argument for segregation. In fact, most scientists and economists would say segregation is bad, or it's hard to make a scientific or economic argument for segregation. So speaking on behalf of the New Atheists, I would say, wouldn't you concede that religion, since it's kind of bullshit that could be interpreted any way you want,
so to speak,
could lead people to do bad things or good things, but science can only lead people to do good things in the end, and therefore.
I don't think science can only lead people to do good things. No, I mean, Hitler made use of science and medical science, and so no. And I mean, that's the thing about Sam's claim that science can determine human values. I mean, I'm not sure if it would be good or bad, but it's not the case. You can't count on science alone to save you. I think science is largely value neutral, except when it does things as like Sam talks about in the book, which are uncontroversial. That if you already have your basic value system, like let's say you want to maximize human well-being. Let's say science shows you that people who are in communities are happier than people who are living on desert islands. Well, then community becomes a value. That's an uncontroversial point. It's not, everybody agrees that's true. Science can inform our values. But the values have to come from somewhere. And science itself cannot be counted on, I think, to lead to a wonderful world. Over there? Right there. And then maybe you two right to left, because, you and you, as you refer to yourselves, right?
Just piggybacking off his question a little bit. Obviously the New Atheists don't have any particular affection for Christians or Jews or Hindus or Buddhists or other people of other faiths. It does seem that there does tend to be a particular animus towards Muslims, and I've heard the argument put forth several times that this is in some way related to both Islamophobic but also just sort of Western imperialist attitudes, and that in many ways New Atheism has benefited from lying itself on the side of Western imperialism and providing a ideological justification for the West's conquest, or combat against Islam or against radical Islam. How much do you buy that as an inherent tenet of New Atheism, or a reason for its rise?
Okay, well, thank you for the question, Ben. Ben is a former Union student, and it's not uncommon for Union students to speak about Western imperialism. I guess, I hadn't gone that far. Yes and no. What I would say is, first of all, Sam's book was a reaction to 9/11, okay, the end of faith, which kind of started all this. Dawkins had a prior grudge against religious people. I actually encountered him in Oklahoma. We were both speaking at a conference in the 90s. I got there a day after he spoke, but people were saying, man, did you see the fundamentalists tear into Dawkins? Well, so he was getting grief from Christians over evolution for a long time, and I think, but then right after 9/11 happened, he jumped on the kind of Islam is bad bandwagon, and I think, it's not a whole lot more that is necessary to explain the focus on Islam. I mean, terrorism is a problem. I think people are more freaked out about it than they would be if they thought calmly about the actual risks and so on, and not thinking about it calmly makes it worse often. But it's the problem du jour, kind of, and there's a correlation with Islam. So I don't think it's crazy. I don't think you need to go too far to explain the focus on Islam. On the other hand, I'm cynical enough to have seen the way the powers that be elevate voices that please them and don't elevate voices that don't please them. My own intuition is it's just not surprising that people would be freaked out about Islam, given the way people react to threats. So I don't think it needs a really special explanation. I promised to go to the second row.
So I hear you making a kind of sociological argument about the new atheists, which I wouldn't argue with, that they're arrogant, but I would not accept that I consider myself an atheist, and I don't think that automatically makes me arrogant.
No, not that you're an atheist.
In the same way that you can be a Muslim and not be a terrorist.
Right.
So my straightforward argument for atheism is that I do think if I do a thought experiment of any of the definitions of God that you hear, omnipotent, all-knowing, all of those traits, I can say that I don't see any evidence for that. So therefore, if you have a term, God, that is not clearly defined, it is reasonable to say that it's not true, even if you don't have proof that it's not true, because the term itself hasn't been defined clearly enough.
Yeah, I'm not quarreling with atheism. I mean, as I said, I think the case for agnosticism as opposed to atheism has gotten a little stronger. But I don't have any quibble with atheists. But the so-called new atheists, I mean, part of the definition almost of a new atheist, part of what characterizes them, is said to be this kind of intellectual arrogance and so on. It's not their beliefs about God that I have a problem with. It's not that I think those beliefs are unreasonable.
I mean, I think one of the points that the new atheists make is that the scientific method and empiricism is an approach. It's a way of looking at the world that leads you to test your assumptions. So while the examples that you give are examples of individuals making perhaps overreaching, I think the argument that the scientific viewpoint is self-correcting because of empiricism is still valid, and the criticism that religion inherently, philosophically doesn't do that or forbids that. And you can give examples of scientists who are religious, who practiced empiricism, but there's still a long and robust philosophical body of argument for religion, placing faith above empiricism.
Right. I think maybe I missed. Maybe I misunderstood something or missed. What is your? Is there?
I guess it's not a question. It's a statement that you could perhaps rebut.
Okay. Is there? So can you? I'm sorry. I hate to ask you, but can you say it again, maybe in roughly the same way, and I'll pick it up this time. But
sure. So it seems to me that the new atheists make an attack on religion because religion places faith above empiricism.
Oh, right.
And that the scientific method does the opposite, and thus perhaps can ultimately get at empirical reality over time in a way that religion cannot.
Oh yeah, I think science is unrivaled as a system for figuring things out because it corrects for individual biases. And they would make that point, and I agree. What it does is it says, look, you do a theory. It has to be testable. We're going to test it and figure out who's right. Now, some questions are not susceptible to the scientific method, but within its domain, it's unrivaled. The new atheists would say that. I agree with them. It gets back to the fact that I'm not complaining about their views on religion. And in fact, as for faith, I mean, I'm as I said, I'm trying to. I think I have a worldview that doesn't depend on faith, but qualifies as spiritual. So I'm not asking you to take anything on faith. Okay, so we've been doing this a while. Maybe we should take like 3 questions just in a row, and I'll kind of write them down, and then we can let people on leave, and then anyone who wants to stay can gather round. So where's the microphone? Do you want to be in charge of choosing people, Philip? That awesome responsibility. Just 3 people.
Start here. Hi, thank you for coming this evening, Robert. I'm very confused how any sane person could blame religion for terrorism, violence, war, when it could not possibly have anything to do with religion. It's a consciousness in that individual or those individuals, which would be a mass consciousness. And religion is it's a man-made thing. All these books written by men. So no theory could make someone be violent. That would have to be in the consciousness of the violent person, which is completely irrelevant to any religion or so-called religion. So these men, Sam, Richard, Christopher, whether they believe in God, a God or not, is irrelevant to actually what they're saying, because what they're saying is pretty much insane.
Okay, I think I take your point.
Okay, next question. It's sort of a double question, but it's going to make sense. There is something for me very interesting about the new atheists. Is this paradox, is that they all claim to come from an evolutionary worldview, right? They're all the sons of Darwin.
Pretty much.
And yet, they are incapable of understanding religion in evolutionary terms, right? And so I was wondering if you had, I do believe, I've seen some of them, especially when you interview them actually, and Christopher Hitchens, I think, obviously has personal issues. It's really obvious. And look, I don't want to undermine the guy, but the individual psychology of those people have something to do, right? So I was wondering if you had some thought about this. And my second question coming from that would be, from hearing them, I personally see the same type of consciousness as you were mentioning as fundamentalist. Okay, it's only one perspective, only one logic. Mm-hmm. They're right, everybody else is wrong. Everybody should change their mind, and the others are fundamentally dangerous. For me, it's a fundamentalist worldview, and I was wondering if you had a reaction to that.
Okay. And finally,
I greatly appreciate your evaluation of the arrogance of the new atheists, and I appreciate that a great deal. At the end, I thought you were going to answer my question, and I think you tried, and I may have missed it when you were talking about what you meant by spiritual. 30-something years ago, it occurred to me that there was something about spirituality growing in culture, and I was writing and thinking and talking about and trying to figure out what spirituality was, and I discovered it was the religion that I grew up with my childhood. So,
which is what?
Unitarian Universalist. That's what binds me to life, my religion. And I wonder, and you say my spiritual worldview, are there other, in one way you're contrasting that to a scientific worldview, yet I hear you also wanting to incorporate a scientific worldview. And so are there other words that would work, or why do you prefer spiritual rather than a unified worldview, or
okay.
a holistic worldview,
Okay.
or a religious worldview?
Okay. So that is the third question. I'm not sure I can respond satisfactorily at all. The first was about how do you blame religion? Isn't it more of a thing of mass consciousness? I don't know. I mean, I think I'm not such an absolutist in minimizing the role of religion that I don't think some religious doctrines actually matter. I mean, if you believe in an afterlife, you're more likely to be willing to die while killing somebody than if you don't. And there are things like that. You know, if your religious text offers you an excuse for killing people, you're probably more likely to do that than if there were no such sustenance for that kind of behavior in your religious text. So I don't think religion is completely irrelevant. I think its role is tremendously overstated, the role of specific religious doctrines in fomenting violence relative to the kind of material circumstances I talked about, you know, like having your country invaded by the United States and stuff like that. But I don't think religion is irrelevant. But I do think, I mean, the contents of a given religion, in terms of like the beliefs, the scripture, that's the hardest thing for us to change. You know, the thing we can, in principle, change are the circumstances in which the, you know, these kinds of material circumstances, like not invading countries and stuff. So that's why I kind of emphasize things other than religious texts. I doubt that responds very directly to your question, but it's the best I can do. Okay, the various new atheists, I'm not sure what you mean by viewing religion in evolutionary terms. There's a sense in which some of them do view it in evolutionary terms. Dan Dennett has talked about what it is about the evolved human brain that he thinks gave rise to religion. There's a separate sense, the sense in which religions themselves evolve. I've written about that in my book, The Evolution of God, and my own view is, you know, on balance, religions have tended to evolve in a healthy direction if you compare them, you know, millennium ago or so, and that is itself, I think, a product of kind of modernization, closer integration among societies, getting to know people in other cultures and stuff like that. But religions do change, and sometimes the circumstances most conducive to their changing in a positive direction is not to make them feel too threatened. As for whether the new atheists are fundamentalists, I don't know that I'd go that far. I mean, again, my view is I don't know whether you want to call them, I wouldn't call them a religion. I would just say that, like so many groups, including ideological groups, including groups I belong to, there is just naturally a kind of psychology of tribalism that tends to infiltrate groups that view themselves as, in some sense, in opposition to other groups. On the spiritual question, so you are a Unitarian Universalist, which some people would call spiritual but not religious. Not a lot in the way of Christian doctrine remains central to Unitarianism.
I see it as a religion, not an alternative to religion.
Okay, that's good. You know, it's a you know, I mean, there certainly are. I've been to a Unitarian church where the minister insisted not only that there wasn't a God, but that there was no higher purpose in the universe. And I thought, wow, I've never been in a church before where the minister was less religious than I am, because I think there's at least a chance of a higher purpose. But anyway, did you have a question about how I'm defining?
What spiritual?
Well, I guess, you know, I'm going to try to.
Spiritual worldview is they're an equivalent,
Yeah.
like a holistic worldview.
Yeah.
Spiritual is a loaded word.
Yeah.
Use it a lot, but I'll just
Well, different people mean different things by it. And a lot of people mean something kind of supernatural by it. If they may say I'm spiritual but not religious, and they believe in some kind of, you know, I don't want to ridicule anybody's beliefs, but they you know, they believe in something that science does not tend to corroborate. I don't want that to be part of my spirituality. I mentioned one thing that is a really taking seriously the idea that the human brain is really bad at assessing reality, that it's designed by natural selection to do things other than judge people accurately, and in all kinds of subtle ways, it really, really misleads us. So taking seriously the idea that we live in a world of delusion, and clarifying our view will make us better people and get us closer in touch with moral truth. But there are also, there are a lot of things that moral worldviews, spiritual worldviews do for people. They provide consolation, inspiration, hope, and I'd like to think that my worldview does that, and some of the items on the spiritual checklist it can cross off. As I said, I take seriously the idea of a larger purpose unfolding through the workings of nature. I'll be talking about that in a later lecture. At the same time, I can't say that I'm sure there is such a thing. I mean, if you want to have a worldview that's not, can't appeal to scriptural authority or personal revelation, you have to settle for beliefs that are less than certain, less than completely confident, kind of probabilistic beliefs like, I think, there's some evidence that, that there's a purpose here that may tend toward the good. And the question is, can you get some inspiration out of that, even though you're not sure of it? That's a challenge, but it's the kind of challenge you're left with if you want to be if you're an agnostic, in a sense, and certainly if you're a so-called new agnostic. So I don't know if that satisfactorily answers your question, but I do look at the kinds of questions that have been central to religion, larger purpose, moral truth, providing consolation, and so on. And I ask myself, how many of those things, can I kind of do with my worldview? And the more of them I can do, I guess the more justified I'd feel in calling it spiritual. So again, I'm happy to stick around, but thanks to everybody for coming.